Yo, what is up guys? Val here and welcome to Casual Copium, where we bring you our weekly dose of hope, cope and dope for our casual players. In today's video, I'll be talking about the dash deck I brought with me to win the first Pro Quest of the season and the journey I took to lead me to these gold foil snappies. It was a fun day of chromatic games featuring the likes of Hayden Dale, Arsenal Pass, Fluke and Box and the Tour Timmy in attendance, and with the wide meta on the day, I ended up playing against all kinds of different heroes. We'll talk about what influenced my decision to play Dash, the opponents I played along the way, spoiler alert, they're cracker, and how I found the deck overall. Going into the ProQuest season, I wanted a deck that had a decent matchup going into the big two, being Starvo and Chain, but at the same time also had a decent coverage against the rest of the meta as well. Now, I played around with the idea of going Briar, Ice Lexi, and purely Boost Dash, but what ultimately drove me to this iteration of Dash was, on the eve of the Pro Quest, I wake up in the middle of the night with a notification on my phone saying, Arsenal Pass has just created a new video. From there, you go on and see old mate Hayden Dale talking about the deck that he brought with him to Pro Tour, and was going to be the deck he played had he not decided to sleeve up Kano in the very last minute. From there, I knew it was at that moment I had to sleeve his deck up and try it for myself. I won't be going through a deck tech, there's already a video made by the author, so I'll just be going through some of the key cards that I found were instrumental in the deck. For the full version of the deck tech, visit Arsenal Pass on the link down below. And for the full sideboard guide on the deck, subscribe to the Patreon also provided below. Dash is one of my favorite heroes going into the current meta, reason being is because she gets access to some of the most efficient damage dealers in the format, and whilst you have a trade-off of not having too many important on-hit effects and fatiguing out your deck, ultimately the goal of your deck is to try to put pressure on your opponent and kill them before you even get the chance to fatigue your deck out. And we do that with a combination of the boost cards we have on hand, as well as loading up our items and shooting our opponent's face with the pistol. At the same time, the deck does have a transformational sideboard, turning it into a more control-y mid-range style deck for those grindier matchups that we have, such as Oldham and Rhina and Prism. So this deck does a little bit of both, and depending on who your matchup is, we're going to be switching up our cards here and there in the sideboard. Without further ado, let's cue to the dash cam. So in this dash deck, we have a core of our big four hitters, 0 to 60, Super Hit, Throttle, and High Speed Impact. Mostly in all three colors with the exception of High Speed Impact. Now in every single matchup, these cards will always be in the starting deck. On the right hand side of things, you'll see what I like to call my more exotic reds that I'd like to bring in against different matchups depending on what their game plans are going to be. Along the bottom, we have a whole bunch of blue cards which still function as boost effects to continue our boost combo, or otherwise, they also give enough resources for us to utilize either the cards in our hand and arsenal, or loading up items on the battlefield that we can use to load our pistol and shoot at the opponent with. Depending on our matchup, we may side in more reds for an all-out aggressive matchup, or in the more grindier matchups, we might actually want to side in more blues to provide us with the extra resources to 1, get the items, and 2, load the items up. Keep in mind that all these cards are still blocking for free, giving a solid base of defense against the opponent in any matchup that we go through. The first item we're going to talk about is Teclo Pounder. We want to be bringing this in versing decks which also play to an aggressive game plan, like your Rune Blades and Lexis. Race, that's going to be our goal. Most of the time we don't care about the damage they do, as our game plan allows us to come back with much more damage with a vengeance. And with Teclo Pounder, it's a 3-6 damage. The more Teclo Pounders you have as the game goes on, the easier it's going to become for you to end up taking that match away. For our grindier matchups, like Oldhams and Prisms, we have our packages of Induction Chambers and Plasma Purifiers. where we want to side in more blues to be able to make use of getting the most value out of our items by being able to use Spark of Genius for 4, get Induction Chamber or Plasma Purifier out, and from there, use those items to shoot at the opponent. In those situations, reds aren't going to be as good in that matchup, so you might want to be taking out a few red action cards and loading in a few more blues so that you do get the resources to effectively make use of these items every turn. The final item I want to talk about, which goes into both decks, is Teklo Core. The item is very good as it basically starts your turn with 2 Tunic triggers for 2 turns. The item really helps you get off on your 5 card hand turns, and sometimes fetching a core with Spark of Genius might actually serve you better than getting that little extra damage. Otherwise, apart from that, those extra 2 resources can also go towards Induction Chamber, Plasma Purifiers when you're trying to load them up, as it can make the difference towards the later end of your match when you're trying to get your opponent to lethal life damage. In the equipment slot, we run a standard set of 4 with an additional Visitronic model for those trying to take advantage of the ProTour Kanos. With Goliath Gauntlet, that's going to be there for your more on-hit effects and to try to force out a block from the opponent, try to get them to commit a card or 2. With Arcanite Skullcap, very straightforward, a free damage prevention card, which in a race against aggro matchups or mid-range matchups are especially important. It makes the difference between stealing tempo back at the end of the game or blocking with the final card in your hand. Same goes with Teklo Foundry Heart, although in this case it does have the extra ability where we are going to be boosting it every turn. As a result, it's a free resource for us, and whilst it does break the chain, more times than not you're going to be putting that resource to good use, whether it's going to be using a card from your hand or using that to load up a pistol to go swinging for that extra 2 damage. The last one, Achilles Accelerator, I found reliant for free uses. So what I like to do is with Spark of Genius, depending on the card that you are able to find, you might want to pop Achilles Accelerator to be able to continue your turn, or otherwise use the card from Spark of Genius to pitch towards getting one of your items. Second use would be to load out multiple items in the same turn. So sometimes if I had 2 Teklo Pounders in hand, I might want to try get that out by cracking my Achilles Accelerator. Sometimes you might have Induction Chamber, Plasma Purifier, any combination of 2 items that you're able to get out. Or otherwise towards the late stages of the game where your opponents are trying to fatigue you out by blocking with every single card, you can also pop those boots for an extra 2 damage with your pistol to go in for the win as well. And then we go into our combo finishes. These cards are really good for the value that they cost and generally work best in a 5 card hand. I'll generally try to side in at least 2 of these cards in each of my matchups. So the first card we have is Overblast, a great card for the end of the combat chain that gets stronger with every time you boost, where normally you'll get this in for 6 or 7 damage. So a 2 cost card, you're essentially getting a naked Command and Conquer here. High Octane, outside of being the Prism Killer and killing all their auras, High Octane sets you up for a whole bunch of pistol shots to your opponent's face, or setting up the board with multiple items. Keeping in mind when you boost, it gives you an action point, but also the card draw effect. So the card in a way does replace itself as well. And then we have Maximum Velocity. 10 damage on a 2 resource card is absolutely ridiculous. Yes, it is conditional, but in a worst case scenario towards the mid or late game, where you no longer have the life to set up those 5 card hands, it's still going to be a block for free, which we'll absolutely take. Compare that to Payload, where you're trying to force free damage in with Dominate, or coming with 10 and forcing multiple cards out of your opponent's hand. The upside on Maximum Velocity is so much better. Now you've seen the cards, let's go into the matchups. So our first matchup goes up against Noah on Chain. So the goal here is to race our opponent out before they really get the chance to get their shackles going on turns 3 and 4. So we wanted to put them under that pressure with our Tekla Pounder in place so that we get that 3-6 damage in first and see where we go from there. So I started the game with a 3 T-bone hand, coming in for 5 1-1. Now, even though my second and third T-bones were only for 1 damage, they still forced out pretty important blocks from my opponent. So my opponent blocked with the arms turn 1, T-bone 1, T-bone 2, they blocked with their skull cap, which would normally block 2 damage. However, in this case, they only get the one damage, so that's a life back for us. And then with the third T-bone, they end up blocking with their spellbound creepers, which in fact destroys it. Had we had a fourth T-bone, that was going to be their Carrion Husk destroyed as well. Turn 2, we drew into a maximum velocity, so I was happy to let my opponent come attack me with their Shackle 2 turn, knowing that I was going to be coming back with much more damage on the very next turn with my 5-card hand. From there, we had taken the tempo, albeit the whiffs from my opponent's banishes didn't help them either. Towards the end, I got my opponent down to lethal hits first, albeit they also got me pretty close as well. But from there, I just kept applying the pressure and let my opponent keep taking blood debt, giving us the win for game 1. Overall, I feel the Runeblade matchup is still slightly a bit more favoured for them, though with this aggro build, it does allow us to put so much more pressure on them that they end up having to attack with half staggered hands, which I was more than happy to not block, because in those situations, the damage that they do to me falls short in terms of the damage that I do back to them. So in round 2, we go up against Andy on Viserai, our teammate, the only Viserai at the event. Despite Skeletor going out of the format, I still find Viserai to be a very viable option into some matchups where their tempo gameplay can pose a bit of a problem to some of the matchups that they do have. For us, it doesn't change our game plan. We're still going to go with an aggressive game plan to try to beat them before their rune chants and attacks get to us. Something we do need to be a bit careful of is Viserai does have a lot of on-hit effects like Medium Grey and Mothrin Skies, so sometimes blocking or pitching with a blue card from hand, like a blue 0 to 60 for instance, actually saves us a good 4 to 5 life, which comes as a better trade-off over the 2 damage go again that we would have otherwise dealt. Again, a very close race with but with the efficient blocking and with Teklo cores coming in, we slightly edged Viserai to get the win to go to our 2-0 start. Going into round 3, I thought it was only fitting that we run up against the dead father himself, Hayden Dale, on the mirror matchup, Master versus Apprentice. At this point in the tournament, all 3 dashes at the event started 2-0, and we all actually got to sit at the same table. It was a funny situation where in front of me I had Hayden, on the left of me I had another dash player, although they had a slightly different variation to mine and Hayden's deck, mainly going off on payloads as their combo finisher. Me and Hayden, we both started on the same game plan. We both started on induction chambers for the mid-range game plan, and for the first few turns it actually turned out to be pretty even. I started my turn with a Tekla core in play. Hayden started his turn 1 doing boost damage plus a Spark of Genius into Teklo core. From there, first few turns we were just trading damage, but then I drew into maximum velocity really early, which made it easier for me, as whatever damage Hayden was going to do on his next turn, I was more than happy to let that go through, knowing that my 5-card hand was going to be dealing a lot more damage back to him. Ultimately, that ended up giving me an advantage when it came to the race to lethal damage, as we ended up catching Hayden in a situation where he had to block with every card in his hand, and eventually we got there with the pressure and finishing it off with the pistol. Overall, it was a very fun match, not only because of the person sitting across the table from me, but with Dash, it's literally a game of maths where you're just trying to calculate what's the most damage I can do with the 4 or 5 card hand that I have, and what happens if I take a card away. how much damage can I do, things like that. So it's a very fun matchup, and I couldn't have thought of a better way to go 3-0 and lock myself into the top 8. So in round 4, we meet Ariane, who's a New Zealand-based player. She stopped by Sydney on her way back from the Pro Tour in the States and was an absolute pleasure to meet. At this point, we were both 3-0 and were guaranteed spots in the top 8. So all I wanted to do was to scout out what type of Starvo iteration she was playing and prepare myself for a possible top 8 that we could have. So as usual, I prepared myself for the aggressive build. Turns out that was all for now, as she already had a pulse in her starting hand. And for the 7 turns that the game actually lasted for, on 6 of those turns she actually had a Starvo fuse ready to go at me. The card disruption from the Oakenolds and the Crippling Crushers was enough to take me out of the game by turn 3. I still kept trying to put pressure on with my boost damage and popping through with the pistols, but at the end of the day, the dominate disruption combo is what really killed me, giving us our first loss of the day. Starvo has always been a favourable matchup going up against Dash and still remains to do so. However, every dog has its days, just like how Briar becomes the best aggressive deck when they draw Channel Mail Heroic early. Starvo also becomes one of the worst decks when it doesn't get to go off on their fuse functions. So with the aggro game plan that we had in place, our goal was to try to take advantage of those opportunities. A lot of the cards in the deck only block for 2 damage, making it very easy for them to leak damage, making it easier for us to apply that pressure on them and to force the opponent to use those much needed fuse cards. So that is our gameplay going into Starvo, trying to take advantage of those situations where they're not able to fuse. Overall, very fun game and very fun person to meet. Round 5, I'm paired up against my teammate for the second time today. Chris, who is on chain, has been playing very well throughout the day, with his only loss coming in round 1 against the Starvo I just lost to in the previous round, in one of the closest slugfests of the day. And he needed that final win to secure a spot in the top 8. As for me, I wanted to be a little bit cheeky and avoid some of the Starvos in the top 8, so using some quick maths, I gave the concession to Chris, and that gave Casual Copium 2 players in the top 8. For Chris, it was his first pro quest ever, and getting to top 8 is no easy feat, so it's definitely props to him for bringing a good game plan into the day. Overall, I ended up with the 6th seed in a meta that featured 2 Dashes, 2 Starvos, 1 Rhina, 1 Dory, 1 Kano and 1 Chain, matching me up against Steven on Kano. Steve is a very good Kano player who unfortunately happened to bubble in all his pro quests last season, so I'm glad he managed to get there this time around. Unfortunately for him, Dash is not one of his more favourable matchups. I sided in Visiatronic model and started the game on the Teklo Pounder to try to execute that hyper aggressive boost game plan. The only difference this time is I tried holding a blue or yellow card back just in case he does decide to go off on the 8th of Wildfire turn, where we do have the damage to prevent some of the damage, making it harder for him to kill us on that one turn. At the end of the day, drawing that a second Teklo Pounder made it very easy for me to finish the game in 4 turns. In the semi-finals, we go up against Flukenbox on Dory. Going into my matchup, my game plan was to still keep the hyper-aggressive boost game plan in play and not care too much about the Dawnblade counters my opponent was going to get. Something I had to be careful of though was I didn't want my opponent to get any reprise triggers, so I was very hesitant to block out on any of the swings that were coming through unless my opponent no longer had any cards left in their hand or their arsenal. A turn that actually did happen was my opponent pitched a red, came swinging at me with a free counter Dawnblade. My opponent at that point only had 1 card in hand. I decided not to block it. Turns out the card he had in his hand was the Quicksilver, giving him an extra resource had I chosen to block. So that was something that was quite life-saving for me. A couple of high octane turns later, I managed to steal the tempo back from him, and started to force some boost attacks on my opponent where he was starting to block out with all the cards in his hand. It was a very close matchup as I ended up getting very close to fatigue range. However, using Achilles Accelerator at the end to force the final 2 life off my opponent gave us the win and gave us a spot in the final 2. It's always a fun match when you go up against Fluke / John. All I needed to do from here was to meet and play against Tall Timmy, and we would have locked out the YouTube trifecta there. Now, before the dual decks came out, I didn't feel Dory posed too much of a threat to the current meta, but with Glistening Steel Blade, there's quite a few nasty lines that can be played now, and it does make Dory a dangerous deck, especially for those who don't know how to block her. So definitely be on the lookout for that coming up in your ProQuest weekend. In the finals, we go up against Brent, who took out both Starvos on the way to the finals. Now, Brent, who was on Reinhardt today, had an extensive background when it comes to TCGs. I actually heard that he was an ex-national champion for Dragon Ball Super. Now, in Reinhardt, I chose to go for the mid-range build, expecting a couple of defensive reactions to come in. So I started down with Induction Chamber as my item of choice, giving us that extra 2 damage per turn to try and break Reiner down. Now, with Reiner's ability to flesh out so much raw damage, gave him the advantage in this matchup, so I had to commit some cards to try and slow down the attacks that do come in, especially from things like Barraging Beatdown and things like that. Sometimes we're forced to block out with our best cards due to Intimidate, making it very awkward for us. Still, game plan is to still boost down our opponent, draw out some of those defensive reactions early so we don't have to worry about them in the late game, and blocking those nasty on-hit effects that we're always worried about. Now, we had to be a bit more careful in terms of the longer matchups when it comes to activating Heart, to try to avoid fatiguing ourselves out in the late game. So I had to think about what that extra resource was going to do. Was it going to be able to force me to play a card from my hand? Would I have been better off just putting it in Arsenal? Was it going to load up a pistol, and was that pistol was it going to do lethal damage? A plethora of questions come to your head when you try to think of whether you need to use the heart trigger or not. And in a long matchup like this, you do need to be a bit more selective in terms of when you want to go off on your heart triggers. Now, we were trading life for half the game with a slight life lead going to me until my opponent had a nasty turn where they had a beast within. From there, they revealed not 5, not 6, not 7, but 8 non-attack cards, dealing a massive hit to their current life total. That gave me the confidence to choose not to block whatever my opponent's next attack was, so that I could come swinging back at my opponent with a 5-card hand. Now, with the drawn Teklo Cores and my opponent's Scabskin Levers giving him 3 action points a turn to steal tempo back from each other, we managed to get down to a 6-1 life advantage to myself. From here, I was quite hesitant to go below 4 life, just to be careful of the double reckless swings that could be coming in place. So I blocked as much as I could to try avoid getting down to that threshold, until I got to a point where I actually saw my opponent pitch the reckless swing to play and an unmovable. That gave me the confidence to let that free damage go through, so I could fight with my opponent a bit and not have to worry about the double reckless swings coming into play. Ultimately, finished that off with another Achilles Accelerator combo to give us the win of our very first ProQuest. Overall, it was a bit of a sloppy game between both my opponent and myself, with myself missing out on some resourcing and blocking triggers. And it wasn't until later on in the night that I actually found out my opponent had actually missed out on an Intimidate trigger. At the end of the day, I don't think that Intimidate trigger would have made the difference though, as I was still having a massive life advantage at that time, and I still would have done everything I could at that point to avoid getting into double reckless win damage. Ultimately, this game was decided on the 8 damage beast within turn. The sample size of each matchup was low. Every matchup I played, whether it was favorable or not, I was able to do what the deck wanted to do, and it has been an absolute blast sleeving up. In terms of the deck itself, you can tell why Hayden and the Arsenal Pass team invested so much time into Dash. The efficient damage thresholds give you massive lines of damage to be able to raise even some of your toughest matchups whilst dominating the rest. It would have been interesting to see how Dash would have performed in the Pro Tour had Hayden decided not to sleeve up Kano instead. If you guys are thinking of sleeving Dash up for the last weekend of ProQuest, I think it's definitely in a great position to catch people off guard, as people don't necessarily know what your game plan is, and with that transformational sideboard gimmick, it definitely puts a lot of people off guard. Now, make sure to check out Arsenal Pass on YouTube and Patreon. Like I said before, 2 of Dash's worst matchups are Starvo and Ice Lexi, and Hayden's sideboard guide addresses exactly how to deal with both. Congrats to Hayden on the very successful deck tech. It could have very well been him who won on that day as well. If you guys enjoyed this video, give us a like and subscribe to the channel, where we keep you up to date on all things flesh and blood. Until next time, peace.